Emily Clark had built a reputation at the City Ledger as a reporter who could get clicks without sacrificing angle. Her editors loved her ability to turn complicated civic friction into crisp narratives that read like front-page drama. So, when the City Planning Commission's scheduled vote on the Riverfront Redevelopment Initiative started generating quiet rumblings from low-income neighborhoods, her editor tapped her for the human interest piece, the activist story, and framed it before she even scratched the first note. "Get me the face of the opposition," he said, sliding a slim dossier across. "Somebody who can deliver a quote about disruption, about how the city's ignoring progress. I want the angry voice." The readers eat that up. The face the city had already warmed up as angry was Malik Washington, a tall, deliberate speaker with a deep baritone that carried even when he chose softness. He had been organizing in the Eastwood neighborhood for 3 years: voter drives, tenant rights workshops, and town hall listening circles, where people came to speak and leave with concrete next steps. His followers called him the one who remembers, because he never let a promise evaporate. To the city's planning bureau and many on the development committee, he was a thorn, loud enough to mobilize turnout, precise enough to make their projected models look like cover stories for displacement. Emily went to her pre-interview expecting the usual performative outrage. She arrived at the community center early and sat in the back of a dozen folding chairs, while Malik moderated a housing justice session. He passed the mic to a tenant who had been given a 3-month eviction notice after her building was sold to a shell company. He leaned forward, nodded, offered a water bottle, and when she finished, he restated her concern with empathy and clarity, adding the data about how similar upgrades had led to 40% rent increases in adjacent blocks. Emily's notes started with the standard descriptors: passionate, combative, unapologetic. But the hour stretched. Malik introduced speakers from different generations: a retired postal worker who'd seen the neighborhood survive redlining, and a college kid whose family had been priced out of their long-standing duplex. Malik did not shout. He framed their stories as shared inheritance. He kept bringing the conversation back to one line: "If you build a future on erasing yesterday, you'll lose both." Still, the assignment pressure hung like a weight. Her editor had already floated a preliminary headline in a group chat: "Angry Black Activist Leads Disruption Against Progress Plan." Emily caught herself nodding along when sources from City Hall whispered that Malik was emotional, overstepping, playing the race card. The language was easy. It required no nuance. She left the center with her recorder full of genuine stories, her draft mentally shaped toward the version her desk expected, and a quiet crack in her certainty that the angle she'd been fed reflected what she'd seen. Malik knew the media calculus. He'd watched previous movements in other cities get co-opted or flattened under headlines that made their messengers caricatures: angry, radical, unhinged. He had seen sympathetic reporters show up, extract a soundbite, and walk away with a quote that fit their pre-written frame, while the deeper policy levers continued turning unexamined. The scheduled public forum at the downtown Civic Auditorium, marketed by the city as a final feedback session before the redevelopment vote, was his chance to pull back the curtain. He spent the days leading up to it not only refining the data, but centering the narrative on something his grandmother had told him: truth that's only numbers can be ignored. Truth that's human sticks. He rehearsed with his coalition. They had their policy brief: a 3-part explanation of how the redevelopment plan would displace 1,200 long-term residents, the opaque ownership trail of the proposed investment partners, and the failure of the city to enforce existing affordable housing covenants. But his speech would not be a dry litany of statistics. He crafted it as an invitation to remember how Eastwood had once thrived, to feel what eviction does to a child's sense of stability, to see the humans behind the planner's efficiency metrics. He also heard a rumor: a reporter from the Ledger, the one who had called him that activist in a forwarded email, was going to be there. Malik didn't intend to call her out publicly, but he adjusted the opening of his speech. It now included a passage about how the stories that get told about a movement often begin with a question: Who gets to define the rage when it's righteous, and who gets to name it dangerous? He would not let the room reduce him to a stereotype. Behind the scenes, Malik's team constructed a visual anchor for his moment. They arranged to have tenants, schoolchildren, and elders in the front rows, so their silent presence would punctuate his words. A young resident named Tanya, who had been forced out of her childhood home and lived 2 blocks over in temporary housing, agreed to stand with him when he finished his speech and offer a raw, unfiltered testimony. Meanwhile, Emily's editors sent a brief update. Need copy by midnight. Angle should contrast the redevelopment's promise with the protesters' obstruction. If Malik's speech veers into personal attacks, highlight emotional intensity, readers respond to passion. The memo landed in her inbox like a dare. She sat in her apartment, keyboard open, glancing frequently between the organizer's listing and the draft she'd started. She told herself she'd give him space to speak, that she'd let the audience's reaction dictate whether he was a force or a fringe. In private, she scribbled a side note. What if I'm wrong about what I expect to hear? Then deleted it, fearing it would make her seem indecisive to her editor. The night before the forum, Emily dug deeper. She had intended to file a preliminary piece built on the opposition narrative, quotes from city council members frustrated by disruptions, a development executive talking about revitalization, and a side box with a quick biography of Malik that subtly leaned into his activist credentials with the word combative underlined. Instead, she asked Malik for a short one-on-one, under the guise of flesh-out profile context. He said yes. He did it not to soften himself for a headline, but because he believed journalists could become part of accountability if they chose to see instead of reduce. They met in a small diner near Eastwood, the kind with pie plates on the wall and coffee never quite cold. Malik ordered black coffee. Emily hesitated and took a sweet tea, habits from comfort zones. He spoke without a rehearsed script. He talked about the first time he had seen families moved out of their rental near the river because a developer cleared the books and the landlord suddenly had a buyer. He talked about his mother working 2 jobs and being priced into a trailer because the property taxes rose while the city praised neighborhood improvement. He talked about the night his cousin, a small business owner, had been threatened with fines for unauthorized signage, while new luxury boutiques had their facades approved in 24 hours. He also told her what made him angry, real anger, not the caricature. The anger at watching volunteers fill out application after application for housing assistance, while proposals for luxury condos sailed through. The anger at elders being referred to as resistant to change, when they resisted only the erasure of their lives. But he layered it. Angry is a short word for the muscle it takes to lift people who've been ignored so long, their voices echo quieted. Emily listened. She had been trained to slot his stories into a pattern. Colorful background, tension, inevitable clash. Instead, the story expanded. The same developer who promised new jobs had a history of using break clauses to displace tenants. The feedback meetings had been scheduled at times working people couldn't attend. She found herself asking about the neighborhood's historical covenants, the city's failure to enforce them, and whether his movement had a strategy beyond protest. Malik didn't deflect. He showed her a binder of community-collected data, a list of people who'd signed petitions, and a one-page plan that included not just resistance, but alternative economic proposals. When the interview ended, Emily's recorder held 3 hours of layered material that didn't fit neatly onto the angry activist's scaffolding. On her way out, Malik placed a hand on her shoulder. "You'll have your angle," he said gently. "Most of us do. Just don't make it the story that buries the rest." She nodded, uneasy, not from guilt, but from the dawning recognition that if she flipped the draft the way she'd been instructed, she'd be flattening complexity for engagement. That night, she crafted 2 outlines. The first still leaned toward the expected, the second watermarked truth version. Began with a headline she hadn't pitched. Eastwood's Forgotten Voices Force City to Confront Cost of Progress. The Civic Auditorium was packed beyond capacity. The city had set up a polished panel of developers, planners, and a keynote speaker from the mayor's office behind a long mahogany table. The audience overflowed into the aisles. longtime residents in worn coats, college students with clipboards, and a noticeable chunk of media seats filled with cameras and press badges, including Emily, her notebook open, her face composed. Malik's coalition members filled the front rows in coordinated colors, navy blue and gold, silent but unmistakably present. Before the forum opened, Malik caught sight of Emily at the back, fingers poised on her keyboard, and walked over. He did not call her out in front of the crowd. Instead, he leaned down slightly and said, "You still carrying the same idea you had when we met? People will listen differently when they think they already know what you're going to say." She gave a tight smile, and the exchange was brief. He stepped away and her fingers hovered over the keys with new friction. The event started with the city's polished presentation, glossy renderings of mixed-use opportunities, projected job growth statistics devoid of displacement language, and a slick video of smiling new residents in hypothetical luxury apartments. Then came the public comment period. Malik's speaking slot had been pushed later, the city strategically balancing so those tired from early speakers might leave. When his moment arrived, he stepped to the microphone, not with fire, but with a measured presence. He opened by saying, "They told me to keep it short. They told me to temper the rage. So here's what I'll do. I'm going to tell you the truth in 3 acts." He outlined the first act as history, how Eastwood was promised community ownership in the 1970s, only to have profits siphoned out by successive layers of redevelopment. The second act was the present, how the new plan, under the banner of progress, used opaque investment vehicles to push out families. The third act was a question. What happens if you erase the people who know how to keep a neighborhood breathing? Midway through, he pivoted. He addressed the room and, without naming her, said, "We've seen stories written before the words hit the page. People come with their notes, their heads already formed. I don't need a headline. I need accountability." The subtle implication landed. Emily's eyes flicked up. He didn't look hostile. He looked weary in a way that asked, "Will you see, or just report?" Then Tanya came forward. Malik stepped aside as she took the microphone. Her voice cracked. She had been sleeping in a living room that used to be her bedroom, in a house that had new upgrades promised to pay for itself with luxury rentals. She described waking to a notice taped to the door, the smell of fresh paint masking the threat, and the way the city's digital portal kept logging her application for housing assistance as incomplete, though she'd followed every instruction. The council tried to shift the conversation to broader economic benefits. Malik cut in, not angrily, but with a controlled firmness. "Your models don't count the cost of a child's sleep disrupted when she doesn't know if tomorrow she'll have a roof. That's what we measure." He then pulled out a sealed envelope, handed it to a sympathetic civil rights attorney in the crowd, who slid it to the moderator. Inside were redacted internal emails, showing how the city fast-tracked approvals to the development's investors while repeatedly delaying affordable housing covenant renewals under bureaucratic pretexts. He closed with the line he had written for himself. "You can call what I feel anger. I call it the sound of love refusing to be silent while you build on top of us." The room, which had been murmuring the whole evening, went quiet in a way that sounded like the pause before a tide turned. Camera lenses swung. Phones recorded. Emily's fingers stopped moving entirely. Her draft sat open, both versions alive. The live stream, originally scheduled for a narrow civic audience, started getting shared. Small independent accounts picked up the raw emotional testimony, and in the press section, even the glossy marketing director from the mayor's office lowered her eyes. The moment Malik stepped down, the applause came. Not the dismissive kind, but a rising, layered response. The quiet clapping from tenants who recognized themselves. The hesitant acknowledgement from some in the back row of longtime skeptics, and a smattering of outrage from developers. Journalists leaned forward. Emily sat with a knot in her throat and a draft in her cursor. She observed how the council members shifted uneasily. The city press release people started whispering into earpieces. Malik remained afterwards to answer questions, but he didn't retreat into sound bites. He invited her up for a brief follow-up in the hallway. There were cameras rolling in the foyer. Tanya was surrounded by young neighbors, asking when the next meeting would be. Emily stopped him, asked for 5 minutes, and they stepped into a small side room. You came with a narrative, Malik said quietly. What's the headline now? Emily swallowed. She pulled up her draft. The working title: Angry Black Activist Disrupts City Hall Over Redevelopment, stared back at her. She had already written the lead about the outcry and peppered phrases like radical resistance and forceful confrontation. She scrolled to the other outline, the one she'd buried. Community voices expose layers of displacement in redevelopment plan. She didn't justify herself. I can't print what I started, she said. Your speech. It pulled more than emotion. It pulled documents. It pulled people who've been silent. They're in the room now. He nodded. Then print the rest. Don't lead with me. Lead with them. Don't ignore that your first draft would have made us a spectacle and not a story about the system. She went back to her office that night with the two versions, physically opened both in separate windows, and started rewriting. She reached out to council members for their raw responses. Some tried to smooth the story, but a few, quietly embarrassed, offered clarifying quotes about transparency failures. She tracked down the developer's spokesperson. They pushed back with rehearsed language about balancing growth. She included Tanya's testimony in her own words, not filtered, and made space for Malik to define anger on his terms. Her editor called at 11:30. Where's the edge? I need the lead. We can't bury the resistance in fluff. She pressed, showing him the new narrative arc, the envelope contents, the email evidence, the human cost paired with concrete policy breakdowns. He hesitated. There was fear of backlash, of softening the story for readers who were used to simple conflict. She added a small column at the bottom, not buried, titled, My Perspective, What I Almost Missed. In it, she named her own assumptions, admitted how easy it would have been to shape him into a trope, and why she chose to let the broader truth hold the center. The published piece ran the next morning with a headline that startled even some of the editorial staff. Community leaders force city to confront hidden displacement. Activists' speech unmasks policy. Reporter reflects on her own lens. The opening photo was not of Malik mid-shout, but of Tanya standing with her child in front of the aging duplex, eyes steady, the city's redevelopment renderings blurred behind her. Malik's speech and the emails were embedded. The column by Emily appeared alongside as a framed sidebar. The article exploded beyond its usual circulation. Social media picked up the headline. Community forums filled with debates. The mayor's office released a terse statement about thankful engagement, while the redevelopment investors issued a softer tone, promising a review. The city council's scheduled vote was postponed, citing the need to allow for more community input. Emily received pushback. Some readers accused her of going soft on agitators, and some of her older colleagues muttered that she had lost her edge. Her editor, after an initial flinch, quietly admitted that the piece had generated the most substantive engagement in months. Not from the usual outrage clicks, but from follow-through, calls to town halls, volunteer sign-ups to join oversight committees, and emails to council members citing specific policy failures named in the article. He didn't highlight the self-reflection column in the morning meeting, but he didn't kill it either. Malik's coalition felt vindicated, but he also held them to the same standard. He publicly thanked Emily in a town hall, noting that seeing my story with its full weight mattered more than the initial impression. He began inviting her to sit in on future planning sessions, not as cheerleading, but as participation in transparency. They developed a working, cautious alliance. She would report, but he would help contextualize, and he would call out when the frame started slipping back to convenience. The fallout landed on the developers differently. The internal emails spurred an ethics inquiry into the fast-tracking of approvals. Community pressure forced the creation of a temporary redevelopment oversight panel that included Malik, Tanya, Emily as a non-voting journalist, liaison, and a pair of disillusioned but reform-minded city council members. The panel demanded public disclosure of investment partners, enforcement of existing covenant protections, and a guarantee that any displacement would include no-cost relocation with long-term affordability measures. Emily had to negotiate her own newsroom's boundaries. She was asked to speak in a staff meeting about how her piece ran counter to the usual conflict narrative, and to help create a new internal workshop about listening before framing. She pushed for that workshop to include community voices. The lesson wasn't just about her, it was about how, institutionally, the first draft of a story often defines the public's reflexive response. 6 months later, the city had not rubber-stamped the redevelopment as originally drawn. Instead, it had opened a phased process. The original plan was paused. A new inclusionary zoning amendment was drafted, and a community investment trust was created to give residents a stake in future development. The oversight panel published its first report. The headline in the Ledger read, "From Protest to Policy: How Eastwood's Voices Reframed the Riverfront." Malik's name was in the subheader, but the lead image was now of families at a redesigned public plaza, with affordable mixed-use units blooming beside community gardens. Emily's follow-up series chronicled the implementation, the tension, and the inconsistencies with equal care. She ran profiles of former skeptics who changed their outlook, of the city planner who quietly covered up initial delays, and of Tanya, who had moved back into a refurbished home with a lease that guaranteed stability for 10 years. Her editorial, Reflections on Reporting Rage, was reprinted at a national journalism forum as an example of transparency in media. It included an annotated version of the original draft versus the published piece, with footnotes about moments she'd almost simplified and didn't. The relationship between Malik and Emily, born from friction, evolved into guarded respect. He still challenged her when she heard echoes of old framing in her instincts. She still reminded him publicly when he grew tempted to let the movement's narrative harden into a single voice. They occasionally appeared together to speak about civic engagement, he about organizing, she about the ethics of coverage, emphasizing to university classes and community groups the power of story when it refuses to flatten complexity. The truth had been printed, yes, but more than that, it had been amplified into action and embedded in structures with feedback loops. Malik's original line, the one about who gets to define rage, became a tagline on a small community-produced poster in the Civic Center. Anger isn't the story. What you do with it is. Emily kept a copy of the first draft tucked into a drawer, not as a relic of failure, but as a reminder of how easily narratives can slip, and how laborious honesty sometimes must be to hold.